Oh, it doesn't show, sorry. Yeah, then humans, okay, sorry, my slides are not good here. Well, I just wanted to say that, yeah, for humans, training to the beat is also a gratifying experience that makes us involuntarily move, as Petri showed with his granddaughter. And this is very intriguing and engaging aspect of the musical experience. And then, it's not there, sorry. One of the most extraordinary findings in neuroscience about rhythm is that only listening to music can engage motor regions of the brain. And this movement may actually result, when we move to music, it actually makes sense because it may result from processing the beat in motor areas. And yeah. And even only imagining music can actually engage those motor areas, which is pretty amazing as well. Also, not only motor areas, but there's a connectivity between motor and auditory areas, and interaction when we listen to very salient rhythms. And I don't know why I cannot see this. Sorry. Okay. Then neuroscience of rhythm. So neuroscience of rhythm is a field that is attracting increasing research because of the applications that we have seen in clinical domain, but we cannot still understand. So also rhythm has remained less tractable than other musical dimensions because it shares the timing component with other functions, so it's very hard to disentangle what's going on with other functions. Then, of course, I mentioned the therapeutic potential. And, of course, more and more we have better computational equipment and power, so we can tackle these problems that before were not so easy to tackle. So that's why the neuroscience of rhythm is emerging now. Sorry about my slides. Oh my God. Okay, so we specifically looked at one dimension of rhythm processing, which is the clarity of the rhythm of the pulse. And the novel aspect of this study was that we used a blind source separation method to analyze the data. We use independent component analysis, which looks at reciprocal relationships about all the regions, all the voxels that we examine in the brain, instead of just looking at bidirectional interactions. So what we find is maps that we can call networks because they all are interconnected. Okay, so to give you an idea of how ICA works, for those of you who don't know, imagine that these are the spatial patterns of brain activity. So ICA assumes that these activity patterns we observed are a mixture of the true underlying patterns of brain activity, which are independent of one another. That's one of the assumptions. So what ICA does is it separates this mixture into what it considers are its underlying true sources, what we call independent components, and knowing nothing about them or how they were mixed. So now we can extract the pulse clarity information from the acoustic stimulus, from the music, and get this kind of footprint of it, and then we can match it with the footprint of each spatial map. And then we can actually identify which of these spatial maps corresponds to pulse clarity, and we can assume that that underlies the processing of pulse clarity when we listen to music. So once we have identified the different components, the specific component that relates to rhythm perception, what we found was a network that comprised auditory and motor areas of the brain. So in blue, you can see mostly motor areas, and in red, auditory cortices activated. So this all forms a network. And the different figures mean different, the compositions that we did assuming different number of sources, because that's one of the parameters that you have to choose when you apply ICA. So in a way, it's a form of doing a more fine-grained decomposition of the data. So you get smaller areas. Okay, so one of the things we noticed was that it conforms to previous research because we have auditory and motor areas in the same network responding to this aspect of rhythm processing. And another thing that we noticed was the polarity. So the auditory cortices would show all the decompositions in red, which means that it's responding positively in respect to the blue areas that are more motor-related areas. So the way that we interpreted this polarity could be that when processing rhythm, or the clarity of it, when the pulse clarity in the music is high, when the music is easy to, when the music is easy to follow in terms of its beat, the auditory areas would engage more at the same time that the motor areas would disengage. But when the pulse is not so clear and we're having a hard time tracking the beat, the motor areas would activate more, as if they were having a hard time finding the beat. So that's the way we interpret the data, the resulting maps, at least. And another nice thing about ICA is that we could actually see a hierarchical decomposition of this network. So at higher, when we assumed a lot of sources or a high dimensionality in the data, we only get the auditory cortices, and which showing all the decomposition. So maybe the auditory cortices are acting as a hub in this network. So we can see a hierarchy of levels of processing rhythm. And also, looking at the temporal courses of participants, we found evidence to believe that non-musicians would rely more on the acoustic content of the music than musicians when they process the musical pulse, because the model of pulse clarity that we used is based on the acoustic content of the music. It has no top-down rules. So this would mean that musicians would rely more on their learned rules of metricality that they have acquired through the experience of musicians. So that would facilitate mass musicians to internally track the pulse better than non-musicians. And yeah. So to sum up, we found out that there are processing differences between groups in terms of rhythm between musicians and non-musicians, which would support the idea that musicians possess enhanced models of beat induction, maybe based on their knowledge of these metricality rules, based on their musical training. And also, interestingly, we found this polarity between action and perception systems within the network that we interpreted in that way. So, all taken together, what these studies all tell us about the music-brain interaction could be the following. That changes in the brain of musicians can be seen in the music listening brain. And these findings show how experience in one modality can affect another modality, which we call cross-modal plasticity. In many cases, it opened up new questions more than it answered. And more generally, it presents music as a framework to study brain function, especially the capacity of the brain to change itself, to reorganize itself. Plus, if we study the brain-music interaction, this can be mutually revealing. So not only we will learn about the brain, but also about music. So it's a two-way road. And hopefully this knowledge would contribute to a better understanding of the relationship between the brain and music, and which is also interesting for basic research and probably even more for in clinical settings for instance, design aspects you mentioned earlier, musical activities to address problems in non-musical domains. Yeah, a direction that seems promising nowadays. And with this, I think I finished my talk, and thank you very much.
Okay, so questions? Lots of questions.
Thank you. So from my perspective, it was still fairly technical.
Sorry?
From my perspective, it was still fairly technical.
Okay.
So I want to ask a question which is much more basic. All right. So you did distinguish between, say, a musician and a non-musician, right? But in my head, again, there are a lot of doubts of whom we would call a musician in the first place.
Yeah.
Right?
You're right. Yes.
So would it be, say, an instrumentalist? Because you were taking the examples of a pianist and a violinist, for example. So would it purely be an instrumentalist for that matter? Or sometimes there are cases where you have passionate music listeners who are probably not instrumentalists per se, but when it comes to predictive ability, they may have that predictive ability to think about what kind of piece, what bars are coming in the future.
Yeah.
Right? And so that was one thing that I was wanting to figure out. So what is the kind of a subject?
Yeah, you want to know like the criterion to divide.
Criteria of division. Yeah. And then I'll just ask the second question itself so that I can pass it on next. Yeah. This was where they were hearing music, listening to music, which you had physically played or maybe using a headphone.
Yes.
Could there be a study where, because people imagine music?
True, yeah.
Right, in their heads. How does that stimulate the brain? I don't know, I was just thinking how it might. So if there is something of that sort. Thank you.
Okay, the first question, I think the criterion for musicianship was to have at least 5 years of professional musical training, like in an academy or conservatory or something like that. Also to have earned some money playing music, self-reporting themselves as musicians, and was there something else? Okay, for non-musicians that they should never have like earned any money or. Yeah, but basically that was the threshold to consider somebody a musician or not. But as you pointed out, it's like a continuum, so it's very hard. But you have to make this choice. Maybe in other labs they use other criteria, more stricter criteria, like maybe you have 20 years of music.
Like say a vocalist, right?
Yeah.
Who is not an instrumentalist. That is
no,
one.
Actually, no, we didn't have any vocalists, only instrumentalists. Yeah.
Then the second small part is, again, within musicians, there are people who would read the music and play as it is, versus people who are creative and compose something newly. Would there be a difference?
I didn't understand the question.
So, for example, there would be musicians who are, of course, trained musicians, but who are, reading the music and playing it, say, in a symphony or a concerto, whatever may be the case. Yeah. They're very particular about that music, versus somebody who has actually composed the music, who has
like
composed
composers, you mean?
Composer, exactly. Composer versus a musician.
All the musicians we had were instrument performers, like instrumentalists, and some of them had some experience composing music, as I could see from their reports. But all of them played an instrument. But I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I was asking if there would be any difference in the responses.
Okay. Like. That's. We haven't done that because probably we don't have the number of participants required for testing that. But it's hard to know what we would see because all composers have, of course, have been training in some instruments. So probably that would you know, show in as similar to pianists or violinists or other instrumentalists. Maybe they have other abilities that would surface when we analyze the data. And we have also behavioral data to compare and relate it to, like, maybe they have better predictive abilities, or I don't know, could be.
Actually, to add to that, there's work on musical imagery. So when they ask you to imagine, either instrument sounds or some other things, so there is work on that.
Oh yeah.
But they tends to be, you imagine a small part of it. You can't say imagine the entire song. You don't do that.
But imagining a person can imagine anything that they personally want, so yeah.
So there is that work is done, but
Okay.
it's a very again we
Yeah. So you say that composers would have improved imagery abilities, maybe because they have to kind of compose music, think about music, and transcribe it, or maybe.
But I don't know where it would show.
Yeah. That's hard to. Yeah. Or maybe it doesn't show.
No, I was just thinking how the brain map would be different. I'm just thinking on those lines.
Yeah, that's really hard to predict because brain is so complex. And maybe it's not with fMRI, but with other type of methodology that look at electrical activity or rather than the blood flow. Yeah.
The musical perception area, the imagery area are the same. It involves the same networking.
There's some study on, if you're asking about on the spot composers, like how Indian musicians would do. So how Indian musicians would compose on the spot improvisation or alap or come up with manodharma that we call, is that if we take an analogy of jazz musicians similarly, there's some work done on that, and fMRI studies, I think it's to do with lowering of frontal functions, like cognitive process, active cognitive processing kind of gets subdued and more posterior activity is seen. So it's to do that you're not aware of what is happening, you're not keeping yourself in the flow, but then you go into a more, I would say, kind of a default mode perhaps. Yeah. There's some work done, and what we mentioned about imagery also. In those studies, the challenge, of course, is you assume and you inform the participants to assume, imagine music. They could go into the gantry and do something. Those are the challenges, part and parcel of such studies.
not possible to scan when they are performing on stage. That's the little impossible task.
Okay, I'm a music composer. I can give you a little bit of a perspective. Now, I make my own music, and I'm also a performer. I've performed with other musicians as well. And from what I've seen is every player, even they're not professional composers, they have a little bit of composing ability. Everybody, tries different ideas and tries to come up with. I've worked in bands, and the drummer would come up with his own part. I would not have to, as a guitarist, I would not have to tell him at what tempo and what fills he has to place and what kind of rhythm he has to follow. He would come up with his own part, and he would still think of himself as a player. So it really comes down to whether you are a professional musician or you're not, whether you're just just learning something, or you're following it truly, not just as a performer. You inevitably end up as a semi-composer, even if you're not writing entire songs and making all the arrangements. Every single performer, professional performer, is a composer as well. They can come up with their own parts, they can add to a song, layer it, and I don't see a distinct difference. I don't know about the brain mapping thing, but as far as the aesthetics are concerned, based on my own experience, no difference between a performer and a composer.
Well, I would say that maybe composers have a bigger repository on composing for different instruments.
Yeah,
because
they have
to
that,
think,
that skill set of
But yeah,
putting
of course, I
together
agree
a
with
song.
you. Yes.
Yeah, but I'm sure that every performer can gradually, if he if he or she is inclined, can actually become a composer, because they already have that skill set, and it's just a matter of expanding a little bit and getting a bigger picture of putting together a piece of music.
Sure, I think we all have the ability. The thing is that composers probably have been training that ability for longer, so that's the difference.
It starts from being a player,
Yeah,
then
yeah.
you gradually go to the composing side.
Sure.
I have a little question about the study about musical expectation.
Okay.
So, can you restate the conclusion that so musicians you found had
Yeah, that
better
we found this connectivity because in a previous study that connectivity meant that participants were accurately predicting events, right? So
Right.
the fact that we found it in musicians in those epochs of the music that where they would be making predictions maybe means that they are more accurately predicting what's coming in the music, which would make sense because they are musicians and they are supposed to be experts in the musical domain and predict better.
Right.
So, but of course, it's I think it's a bit of a weak finding because there's no much backup for that, and we don't have any behavioral data from those participants. So it was a very exploratory experiment based on just one study. So I
Okay.
want to just make that clear.
Because I was wondering whether you can, what your conclusion would be about what kind of people have better anticipation, whether musicians have better anticipation purely as a result of their ability to play an instrument, or just the generally high exposure of music they have. I mean, is being a musician being used as a proxy here for greater exposure to music?
Actually, I think
Because anticipation, you would, you can argue that maybe just listening to a lot of different kinds of music makes you more adept.
sure,
at
yeah, just the
anticipating.
listening, yeah, but in this case, that study that found that connectivity between those areas, contained a special component. So we claim that musicians maybe are simulating mentally those actions that produce those sounds, and that helps them. It's a helper for them to predict what's coming up in the music because of this simulation of movements, because they are musicians, so they have been trained to play an instrument. But because of that special aspect, so.
Okay. Right.
But yeah, you mean disentangling what comes from the motor training from the mere listening to music?
Yeah,
Yeah,
disentangling
okay.
just the
Yeah.
fact of the exposure to music
Yeah,
from the actual performance
Yeah.
ability to perform.
yeah. But probably the mechanism, you become better at predicting if you have a lot of listening experience, but the mechanisms are maybe a bit different from playing that music, because then you have an extra action simulation mechanism that helps you
Right.
predict, but it's just speculation, so
Okay.
yeah.
And another second question about the methodology that you showed a person lying down in this is the fMRI machine, is it?
fMRI, yes.
Yeah. So that's a very unnatural setting for someone to be listening to music, right? So I was curious
But
about what kind of post-processing you generally need to apply to the data before you.
Well, the post-processing is like the usual post-processing for any fMRI data, but if you think what constitutes a natural listening, you can listen in the car, you can listen, doing lots of tasks, so, you're just lying down in your bed and listening to music. Okay, this is a laboratory condition and you are in a scanner, but, because it's like almost half an hour of listening, at some point you disconnect and you get into the music little by little, so.
I suppose it doesn't matter because all studies are conducted in the same way.
Yeah, it's like that's the best we have at the moment. So until we have something better, we have to be
And
satisfied with.
One last question is to what extent do these brain headsets make up? So I can imagine they're a lot less precise and a lot less detailed than a machine like this. But what can you get similar information? How close are they to actually giving you similar data than these headsets that people have?
The headsets.
Yeah.
You mean for the noise? Oh no.
Yeah, EEG headsets. Yeah, it's probably very different.
fMRI. So sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Could you collect similarly analyzable data from like state-of-the-art EEG headsets?
Yeah, sure. Like the same condition, listening to music.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's what I was listening to.
maybe we wouldn't get so much deep into the brain, but mostly the cortical areas. But yeah, that's a good complement to the fMRI data. And
Okay.
yeah.
Right. Thank you.
I have a very basic question. When I went for an MRI long ago for some diagnosis, there was a lot of sound that is released. Now, my question is, how is that sound subdued, and is music put into the headset and the volume increased, how does it actually work, this music inside the fMRI machine? Thank you.
You can answer.
Yeah, I mean, you have that scanner noise, but before actually, I mean, I also participated in a study to understand what it feels like, right? But I must say that because the scanner noise is quite repetitive, it sort of fades out. So, and of course you hear the music well enough, so there's nothing, that's not an issue, but it's just that your attention, yeah, so it fades off, and in fact I slept in the scanner briefly. So, but yeah, so and another thing is when we extract, let's say, acoustic features, right? We also extracted the features with the scanner noise embedded, and the way they change is not that different. It's just that there is just a slight boost in the overall energy content, but otherwise, if the change in features remains the same. So I hope that, yeah. Okay, well, last question, then we can head for a quick coffee. Yeah.
So can I ask 2 questions, please?
No, only one. Ask over coffee. Yeah.
Okay. So my question was, what is did you analyze any role of attention, like how much attention a person gives? That varies during, if you're saying it's a half an hour listening session, the amount of attention definitely varies. And for a musician, the kind of attention a musician